Hello again, everyone. If you wouldn't mind beginning to take your seats so that we can get the afternoon session underway. I hope you had a good lunch. I wonder how many people took up the Lord Mayor's invitation to walk up to Plymouth Hoe and have a look at the sea. Maybe you'll do that after we finish at 5 o'clock. We had a wonderful morning, and it was so good to hear at lunchtime various people saying that they were unashamedly stealing ideas that they'd heard this morning, because that's what today is all about. And I saw people taking photographs of the board game that we heard about earlier on this morning from France that has engaged children there to understand a bit more about floods and flood defences and resilience. And I saw quite a few people taking photographs of that and going away to develop their own idea of board games to engage children in the idea of planning for flooding in the future. So it really is working, this conference today, which is delightful to see and hear that people are sharing ideas, swapping stories, and hopefully building on what has already been learnt in the various individual projects that we've been hearing so much about this morning. For this afternoon, we have some tremendous keynote speakers lined up. Keynote speakers who'll be joining us here in person, but also joining us live from France as well. So we will hear a French perspective as well as a British perspective from our keynote speakers in the afternoon session. Hopefully there are no fire alarm tests planned this afternoon, so if we do hear the fire alarm, we will need to use the emergency exits this afternoon, but that hopefully won't be the case. And there will again be plenty of opportunity to ask questions of our keynote speakers. They will be joining us at the end of the afternoon session on stage to answer any of your questions. And if you're watching online around the world, if you submit your questions via the chat boxes, and we'll make sure they're included. We've got one already from this morning left over, which we will include later on. So as I say, we have some tremendous keynote speakers lined up this afternoon. And to get this part of the conference underway, I am delighted to welcome our keynote speaker, Dusty Gedge. Now, Dusty is president, amongst other things, of the European Federation of Green Roof and Wall Associations in the UK. And his presentation this afternoon will focus on green roofs and green walls and the positive impact that they can make on both the environment and socially as well, and for wildlife, of course, and in the context of what we're talking about today, hopefully helping to alleviate issues of flooding. So would you please welcome to the stage Dusty Gedge.
Bonjour, and good afternoon. The French don't have a word for good afternoon, I don't think. I don't know why that one's there. Does this move? Oh, green. There you go. Ah, that's what the one should be there. Hopefully the slides that I hid have been hidden. Yeah, so actually I'm going to give you a European perspective because I am the president of the European Federation. And I just thought I always put this punk postcard in because actually when I lived in Plymouth in 1985, I modelled as a punk for a postcard. And that's me with my juggling partner at that time. I was just saying to Justin, we were actually on Spotlight in 1986 juggling. So I have a little bit of knowledge about Plymouth, but I'm an activist really, but I am a president. And this is one of the things which you will understand because obviously you're involved in a European project. My federation is involved in several European projects, which is why I can be here today. Our federation has members all across Europe, including Indices, which is our national association in France, and we have GROW, which is our UK one. And we're actually involved in several EU projects, Pro-GI-REG and Meta Building. And I think when I get to the Meta Building, I might say something about what the future for BRIC might be. And Meta Building is a really interesting project that actually brings the construction industry from across Europe together to try and come up with innovative solutions to deal with, in my case, nature-based solutions, but they've got digital arms and everything. And one of the issues is it's now finishing in 6 months' time, and how does it continue, which I think is going to be a discussion you're going to have later on, which is a common problem with a lot of European projects. And Pro-GI-REG, I'll just put this one in because in 2 weeks, fortunately, I go to Athens and Piraeus to look at some work that's been done in schools through the Pro-GI-REG project, increasing pollination in Piraeus, which is a city, a port city like Plymouth. So I just have to put those in because it kind of justifies why I'm here. if you know what I mean. We also produce these market reports. Austria, Czech, and the Germans have produced these market reports, and there's one due out in France shortly. And these are actually detailed studies of what nature-based solution market is in those countries. So I wanted to put that in. And June the 6th is World Green Roof Day, which I'm the public face for, but all my national associations make videos for that. So I've now covered my federation, and I can get to what I do, which is actually, I'm a bird watcher, and this is how I got involved in this and how I became president. This is a very common bird in France, but it's very, very rare in the United Kingdom. It's called the black redstart. And that actually led to me leading a campaign with a whole group of NGOs and statutory organisations, it wasn't just me, to write a report in 2008, which led to the London Plan, which is the only green roof policy in the United Kingdom. And my federation was sponsored by the Mayor of London to write this report in 2018, it was written in 2019, to celebrate 10 years of policy in London, but also to celebrate policies throughout Europe. And within it, there's a section on policies in France, like Haute-Seine, the department has very strong stormwater regulation, and green roofs are part of that process. Just highlighting that, so that's that. But very quickly, you know all this, but we design cities for people, we design the countryside for nature, and in between, nature gets in. And that's the basis, really, of my work, and we need to do both. We need to design cities for nature and for people, and it's actually part of the EU biodiversity strategy and the ecosystem services strategy, and I sat on the working groups in Brussels for both those processes. This is a German green roof. It's one of the original ones, and it's what is known as a sand-covered roof because they had a waterproofing in Germany, which was highly inflammable, which is very, very important at the moment because in Europe we've got a lot of conversations about fire, and they covered it in sand, and then it vegetated. Most of you will know green roofs are always associated with sedums. In the centre of Berlin, there were sedums, and this is on the outskirts of Berlin, there were no sedums. The reason being, sedums could survive coal pollution. Just think about it. Yeah. We have lots of different types, and I'm just going to whiz through that bit because I'm going to show you some pictures of these in more detail. And just so anybody who's an engineer this is very, very important because I read a lot of guidance in all languages. The definitions of green roofs are to do with the amount of maintenance that is needed to maintain them. And that is simple. And I'm not going to go through it because I don't have time. These are intensive ones, which are like roof gardens. And these are extensive ones, which need very, very little maintenance. There you go. Why nature? We've got all these things. We've all had a heat wave last year. It's a big problem, especially in fires in France. And Vienna, where my federation is based, got an urban heat island strategy, which green roofs are a very, very important part of that. I suspect, actually after the heat wave in Paris in 2006, green roofs became a very, very important part of how Paris was delivering for the next heat wave, which happened, I think it was 2018, when the strategy actually went in. And green roofs have been part of that, and there's a lot of green roofs going on in Paris. And I don't want London to be as hot as Barcelona because it's not designed to be that hot. Yeah, it's a problem. And this is Copenhagen in 2012, which is what you're about, is flooding. It caused incredible economic damage to Copenhagen and Malmö, which is on the other side of the Skagerrak. This is Bolzano in a flood. Bolzano's in Italy. Has a very, very strong green roof policy. It's one of the only ones in Italy. And I can't get a good picture of this. This is Lisbon after the old town, after 5 minutes. A 5-minute storm in a park 10 kilometres from Lisbon caused that mayhem. There's just something about that picture which kind of sums it all up for me. Cleaning up that street from all those mud. And one of the things I'm just going to highlight, Germany's been the lead for this. This is Potsdammer Platz in Berlin. This is a zero discharge site. They cannot discharge any rainwater from this site. And one of the ways they do it is all these different nature-based solutions. And this was built in 2002. So it is well, well above its time. And that lake is on a roof of a car park. So I like nature, and this is a wetland roof in Switzerland by a river to recreate alluvial gravels. So I'm thinking about your rivers in France. There's a lot of gravels on your rivers. You could do that along your rivers. And I put one up on a famous museum in London, which has since been removed, not because of any problems, but they needed to put some more air conditioning in. And that idea was taken to Malmo, where they've made all these wetlands in Malmo in Sweden. So biodiversity has always been the focus of what I do, though I now have to deal with policy in terms of climate change adaptation. So I'm just going to go into this a little bit, because this is a roof in Switzerland, designed for the Euro finals, because they extended that station. And this is a green roof designed specifically for a lizard and for 3 rare wasps under Swiss cantonal law. And this is one of the ones that I got involved with 22 years ago, which is the original brown roof, and it's doing what it's doing, it's still there. And we have this policy which is based upon research in London and research in Switzerland that creates these habitats on roofs for wildlife. And it's all based upon this document, which unfortunately is only in English, but it is downloadable from BugLife, the invertebrate charity, which is basically a collection of the 2 research projects in Switzerland, in Basel and in London, and tells you exactly how you can deliver a green roof to meet the European biodiversity strategy in terms of what in England we call, UK we call open mosaic habitat. And it's all based on spiders, so if you don't like spiders, don't go on a green roof, okay? But I'm not going to go into it, because spiders like making webs, but you have spiders that like it bare, and if you've got lots of spiders, you've got a good habitat. It's as simple as that. Also, I want to bring this into you before I get to blue roofs, which is where you're more at, is also we have an energy crisis, and also for climate change, we want to be able to put lots of renewable in. You can actually combine them. This is one of the biggest in London, which was designed for the Olympics in 2012, and has met 6 of the 8 biodiversity targets in the Olympics. It's the only part of the Olympics that has met those targets. It's a roof. And if you do it, you can cool roofs, you can cool the panels, and increase the efficiency. And also, because of the way that the panels work, they actually create 2 microhabitats, which actually increase the biodiversity. But if you don't design it properly, i.e., from a green roof perspective, things go very, very badly wrong. And obviously, in France, you have the national law, which is on shopping malls, I think, have to have solar or green roofs. The original MP who put that through Parliament wanted it solar and green roofs, but it was changed in 2018 in the Parliament. I'll just let you know these things. And if you do it well, you can actually deliver better biodiversity. This roof is home to quite a rare butterfly in southeast England, which is small blue, because actually the panels create this wind shade, which means its food plant can grow better on the green roof. But the Swiss are really, really way in front, and this is the future of solar green roofs, is what is known as bifacial. And they actually increase the energy production by 10% because they're vertical, and actually 100% of the roof is out for biodiversity. In Switzerland, they have very, very strong laws on biodiversity on green roofs, and that's why it happens in Switzerland first. And even down in the French-speaking part, in Valais and Genève, there's a lot of these roofs going in down in the French-speaking part. It was driven by the German-speaking part. And also in Austria, you can have rooftop gardens with solar panels and vegetation underneath them. And this is where we get into the people story of my presentation. And this was an innovation to store rainwater on roofs, but also to provide shade in Vienna on rooftops, because it can get to 40 degrees C quite regularly in Vienna now. The urban heat island effect is having a massive impact there. So before I get to the people, I'll do the blue roofs, because I know you're mostly involved with stormwater. And blue roofs are roofs that store rainwater, but you can have blue-green roofs. And this is actually one, I put this one in specifically because it's actually a really good system designed by a French company called Universitaire to meet your greenfield runoff rates, which are higher than ours. And this is actually in Anvers, or Antwerpen, in a project that the city has funded because Antwerp suffers from flooding too. There you go. So we get to people, and obviously I used to be a community theatre person, but I spend my life just watching wildlife on roofs. But this is a roof down in Greenwich, which I'll talk to you about in a minute. And I can assure you, these people are not admiring the green roof. They're admiring the view. Because most people, when they go on a roof, never look at the green roof. They just look at the view, which is rather annoying. And also, I put this in these days because you'll notice there's some astroturf. I tried to fight very, very hard to not have astroturf, but apparently it had to be an astroturf because children will get muddy knees. Children should get muddy knees. And I put this one in specifically. I forgot about this picture because this is actually the Gymnasium Vignol, which is in Paris in the 23rd arrondissement. And it's one of the most fantastic community projects I've ever come across. It is now, there's very little green space, as I understand it, in the 23rd arrondissement. And this has become the unofficial community centre for the arrondissement. And they've got wheat, they've got nettles, they've got grape, they've even got a vignol, and you know they've got a Mediterranean garden, they've got some grassland from the Champagne region. It's just really cool. So people from all ethnic communities can come there and learn about different types of vegetation. So I put that in, as we have French partners here. If you go, you can go on it. There's a cafe, and it's called Gymnasium Vignol. And there's a lot of these going up in the City of London, where I live. This one is actually only for staff, but the City of London, which is what we call the Square Mile, every single new roof garden should be accessible to the public. And there's not a lot of green space in the City of London. And this is another one on top of a Charing Cross station, which is one of our mainline stations in London, and this is an office of a big accountancy firm. But I love this picture because it's in Birmingham, and there's a guy reading a book on a library surrounded by nature. And there's not a lot of green space in the centre of the city of Birmingham, if you've ever been there. It really is. We've got very, very few parks. So that's kind of cool. But this is what I like. And the people in this picture all work in this building. And this was the first time in 10 years they'd ever been on the roof. And because of COVID, I've become really gripped by this, is if you design a roof garden that people have accessibility to, in the United Kingdom it'd be roses and lawn and privet hedge, you know, why can't they go and sit by a meadow? And this meadow here is very like a cockleshell beach I used to go to in my childhood in East Kent. And if you look at this closely, which I'm not too sure it comes up later, and this actually happens in Berlin. This is social housing, and this is just a wild meadow to meet nature requirements that people can sit by. It actually says you can't take your dog on it to, you know, because of stuff, but there is another sign that says you can sunbathe on it if you sunbathe somewhere different tomorrow. So the wildflowers don't get hurt. It's very German. Sorry if there's any German here. You know, strict rules. And I've struggled to get a photograph of this because I've got videos of this, which I hope to make a video. This is one in Zurich. It's a restaurant. It's a high-end restaurant surrounded by wildflowers. There's nothing sophisticated about it. And again, it's because the Swiss have very strong rules for nature conservation. And this video, I mean, this really is a limestone grassland on a restaurant in the middle of Zurich, which is just fantastic. I've not put a lot about green walls in because green walls it's something that my federation does, but it's not that technical. Here's the Bosco Verticale. I've been on it. I know the arboriculturist, Laura Gatti. And it's a really interesting project. People say, oh, yeah, it's only for the rich. But it's very sophisticated what they did here. The trees are chosen specifically for each floor in terms of the cold in the winter and the heat in the summertime. And they're now doing these, actually, I think there's one going up in Montpellier, I think, maybe. But there's definitely some going up in Lausanne. And this is one of the ones that I've been involved with. And this is not a green wall. This is a vertical rain garden. And this is where it's important. If we're going to put these things up, can we store rainwater or use rainwater, in this case, from the roofs? So behind those louvers, there is a great big cistern that's captured all the rainwater from the roofs, and this is only irrigated by rainwater. That is a vertical rain garden. And this is another one by City Hall in London. You can't quite see the pipe, but there is a pipe coming down from the roof that goes to a tank which stores the rainwater, which then irrigates the green wall. Most green walls are irrigated by potable water. We need to join up our thinking here. I just put those in because, oh, there is another one. This is in Zurich, because I've got a video coming out of this. And this is one that cools the building, and it gets hot in Zurich, and behind that is benches for people at Alpine Finance to have their lunch in the shade in the middle of the summertime. Kind of funky, yeah? So very, very quickly, I've done some work for Plymouth. I set up this company. For years, I used to draw little polygons of green roofs in London. I mapped every single roof in London. That's a lot of them. And then we created a company to do it remotely. And obviously, we can actually analyze where you could retrofit green roofs. I could do this for Paris. And actually, I did some work. And we also took this down to ground level. We're actually looking at how you can do ecological remote sensing of habitats. I don't really want to focus on that, but as we're in Plymouth, I did some work, Gedge did some work for Plymouth, and we mapped all the green roofs, but we also mapped where you could retrofit the green roofs. And we're in conversation with a company in France to look at doing the same thing in Nice and Montpellier in the south, which is going to be quite challenging because it's Mediterranean, slightly different building context. But anyway, I'll put that in. So to finish up, this is where I live. This is Blackheath. And these are buns. These are just rubble buns with wildflowers sewn onto them. And I have nothing to do with these. I just take pictures and put them on Twitter or whatever. And the commuters all say this is their favourite part of their journey into London, looking at wildflowers. And we've got to do that. So what I do is every year is I go around South East England and collect seeds. And the circle by Dover actually is relevant because it's Samphire Hoe, which is on this side of La Manche, is where all the chalk from the Channel Tunnel was dumped. And there's a similar site just by Calais, the same thing. And it's now become one of the best places in Kent for orchids. It's man-made. And it's just from chalk from underneath La Manche. And I collect these seeds from all these places, and this is another one, I collect them from here, and I put them. This is the chalk beach. If you come onto one of my roofs, that's what one of my green roofs looks like, a cockleshell beach in sea salter. And that's what it should look like. And I collect these seeds, and I throw them on this roof in Greenwich. And it's most of the seeds that I collect you cannot get commercially. So I'm trying to build up a seed stock for London, which is actually, it's now got 148 wildflower species on it. I'm a really sad bloke, you know, and it looks like that now, and it's incredibly species rich. But the reason why I put that in, because in the 25 years I've been doing this, when I've got a book which was published in 1953, this bird in that book was considered common. You look at that graph, and you can take that graph, would apply in France, in Germany. The linnet across Europe has collapsed. Its population has collapsed. It's now found on that roof that I seeded. There's over 40 feeding on that roof. I find that a bit moving. And this is the building that was on that site in 1999. I know about how many linnets were there because I did all the bird surveys, and there was between 7 and 10 pairs, and it's now been developed. And there it is, all those blue, yellow circles are buildings with green roofs on. There is more habitat on the Greenwich Peninsula now than there was 20 years ago because of the roofs. And that's why there's more linnets, because there's about 15 to 20 pairs, which is nearly double the population. And that is the roof. It's the IKEA, Greenwich. So in my 25 years of doing whatever I've done something for the linnet. I find that a bit moving. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Dusty, and that's given us plenty to think about. Some stunning images there. How does that work in terms of flood resilience, flood prevention? Maybe that's prompted some questions. There will be an opportunity to put any questions you have about the work that Dusty and his teams have been carrying out for the last 25 years or so a little bit later on in the afternoon. Thank you very much indeed for a really exciting and illuminating keynote speech. We're off to France now, and joining us next is our key speaker who is joining us online from France, so you may need your headphones in a moment. We're going to hear from Samuel, who's an expert for the European Commission on resilience and social vulnerability in the community for European research and innovation for security. Would you please welcome, joining us live from France, Samuel Rufat.
The invitation. Yeah, I'm sorry, I still have the translation in the background. So shall I just cut off the sound?
Hello, Samuel, it's Justin, the host here. Can you hear me okay?
Je vous entends, tout va bien. Je peux parler dans la langue que vous voulez, mais si j'entends la traduction en même temps que je parle, c'est compliqué.
It's complicated if I hear the translation as I'm speaking.
Hello, Samuel. I wonder if you can hear me. It's Justin, the host in Plymouth. If so, if you wanted to say a few more words to see if we've changed the translation or stopped it in your ears.
Yes, so sorry about that. I was
Okay.
said good afternoon and thank you for the invitation. Oh, that's fine. Now I can only hear my own voice. That's much better. Thank you. I'm teaching geography at the Cergy University in the suburbs of Paris, and I wanted to share with you some thoughts around vulnerability, vulnerable situation, and invisible people. I'm going to offer you some more thought-provoking remarks, and I would like to challenge with you some of the evidence, false evidence and misconceptions around vulnerable situations and resilience. And I know I can afford to even be inflammatory because if you get upset, you won't be able to throw me things over Zoom. So it's a picture taken 5 years ago during the last major flooding in the south of Paris. And we tend to label the people as vulnerable or as resilient from the outside. But why? And why does that mean? And what would happen if we were to ask for their opinion instead? So last year we ran a survey among 366 first responders and disaster risk reduction experts in Europe. During the winter, and we asked if everyone should be treated equally. And as you can see, most respondents agree that yes, everyone, some population groups should receive aid or care first. And if we ask who should receive help first, the agreement is on the most vulnerable should be treated or rescued first, then people with medical indications should be treated or rescued first, then there is much less agreement for the most easy to reach should be rescued first, or even everyone should be treated equally, only 10% of respondents, and even less agreement for rescuing first the most important social or economic roles to be targeted first. On the other hand, if we ask, have you ever seen yourself people to be treated differently? Most people answer no, and less than 1/3 of respondents answer that they've seen vulnerable people to be treated differently or receive aid first. So with the COVID pandemic, it has been a renewed awareness of groups with special needs, and the practices of triage and prioritizing of some groups. But there is a kind of ethical paradox in this, because there is some kind of conflict between the humanitarian conventions that tend to impose to treat everyone equally, and the social vulnerability paradigm that tends to say that we should prioritize people in vulnerable situations. So here you have an illustration of that paradox when we compare the people answering vulnerable people here should be helped first, and who you have seen being helped first. You see that here a large share of people say no one, I've seen no one being helped first, so everyone has been treated equally, even though they think that people in vulnerable situations have to be helped first. But you also see that there is no agreement, because people giving other answers tend to have witnessed different situations, and also people thinking we should prioritize vulnerable people, which are the majority, are being witnessing different kinds of situations. The other question is who is vulnerable to what? And we compared, we asked the first responders and experts to compare the situation of flooding with the situation of the pandemic with the COVID-19. And you see there is some kind of agreement that all the people, people in poor situation tend to be more vulnerable either to flood or to COVID. The difference being that mobility impaired people are come first for flooding. But then for the other personal characteristics, there is much less agreement, mainly because first responders and experts and researchers tend to give different answers. For example, people in research tend to say that immigrants are in more vulnerable situations, when first responders say that single-parent households or people lacking trust in authorities are in more vulnerable situations. So that lack of agreement is of concern because there is an increasing political demand for targeting people in socially vulnerable situations. You have here the example of the United States with the program Justice 40, launched last year by the Biden administration. And the goal here is that 40% of the overall federal budget has to be targeted to disadvantaged and marginalized communities. To do that, they did a benchmark of different composite indicators, including social vulnerability and resilience indicators, to target the most deprived neighborhoods, to direct all that public money, so 40% of the federal budget, to those communities. Now, the issue is that composite indices can be counterproductive. We already had that conversation with the CDC, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention in the US, showing that using composite indices of social vulnerability, or even a more complex one on environmental justice, to target public funding to specific neighborhoods can be counterproductive. In other words, it would have been more productive to distribute public funding at random rather than to use those composite indices. Because measuring gives us the impression that we know more when in fact we might not know more about those neighborhoods or people in social vulnerability situations, because other research has been finding that while some synthetic indices may be well sustained by theory, they do not perform as expected when trying to validate them with empirical data. And unfortunately, the situation is the same with resilience. We tend to label people as resilient and even label neighborhoods or communities as resilient based on composite indices. But if we go and ask them, their answer is don't call us resilient or stop calling us resilient. Here you have the main example being New Orleans, 10 years after Katrina, where you had that clash of the top-down labeling by the Obama administration, saying New Orleans people are the archetype of the resilient city and so on. And you had bottom-up initiatives, community leaders and NGOs during that campaign. You see on the right, stop calling me resilient, because every time you say, oh, they're resilient, that means you can do something else to help me. I'm not resilient, please help me. One of the issues is that social vulnerability and resilience is linked to the different contexts, but also the tools we use are not addressing intersectionality. So intersectionality calls attention to the need to avoid statements like women are vulnerable or older people are vulnerable in favor of more nuanced view. People are not born vulnerable, they are made vulnerable. Different dimensions of inequality combine and interact with systems of domination and oppression, leading to multiple marginalization. So those multiple social differences are produced and reproduced in response to hazards and crises, and different groups are both affected by and also have their own effect on the impacts of various hazards and climate change impact. So the degree of vulnerability does not depend on one dimension attribution, like a demographic group such as elderly or children. It's the results of complex interaction between many different factors. And when factors of vulnerability intersect, there is an amplification of vulnerability, not an addition, but a multiplication. And this is not captured by composite indices and raw numbers we tend to put on maps to define where are vulnerable people. So the intersectional perspective should find the overlapping segments of elements that result in the creation of vulnerable situation during crisis. And here you have an example of the interconnection between the different dimensions in the background of social vulnerability and resilience, from demographics to coping capacity, including risk perception, behavior, health, and land tenure. So another way forward, instead of using composite indices, is to use profiles. With the social vulnerability profiles, instead of trying to give a synthetic number and map it, we try to map the intersections of the different factors that might lead to a multiplication of social vulnerability or the increase of social vulnerability situations. Here, this is an example with the US, and you have 6 profiles. So you have one profile of lowest social vulnerability, where there is an underrepresentation of most social vulnerability factors, except for density and age. The second profile is low social vulnerability. So here in light blue, low social vulnerability, mobility and rents, high density, low exposure. All indicators are below or close to the mean. The third profile in yellow is medium social vulnerability, low density, medium exposure. Everything is close to the mean, except for mobile home and extractive industries. Then in light orange, profile 4, age and dependency, social vulnerability, medium exposure. In profile 5, you have high social vulnerability, low density, low exposure, combining stronger overrepresentation of female-headed households, minorities, poverty, no automobile, less education and employment, lack of insurance, and also some fraud exposure. And finally, in red, profile 6, high social vulnerability, high density, high exposure, combining strong overrepresentation of most social vulnerability factors, except for age dependency, mobile homes, and nursing homes. This profile is, in fact, facing the worst flood exposure and slightly higher density. So the idea here is to go way beyond the high, medium, low social vulnerability or resilience to actually qualify what is making those communities being in socially vulnerable situations. So not only to target the critical situations, but to give the keys to actually change the situation on those communities, understanding what specific intersection in those communities are increasing the socially vulnerable situations they have and the kind of exposure, in this case, floods they are facing. Another misconception is linked to risk perception and risk communication. And I wanted to take another example linked to Paris in France that has been recently flooded. So we had the three major events. In 2016, there were a major flooding exercise financed by the European Commission with the participation of the civil protection for more than 20 European countries. The irony is that a few months later, there was a major flooding in the Paris metropolitan region. So with 18,000 people evacuated and 750 people refusing to evacuate. And then again in 2018, also another major flooding episode. With 2,500 people evacuated, and again, people refusing to evacuate. And there was the idea that we should do more risk communication to make sure that people behave in the way first responders and authorities want them to. One of the things we did is a large survey after the 2018 flood, and we find that many people have inaccurate perception. So here you see that only 30% of people living in the flood zone answered yes, my home is at risk of flooding, against half of people actually living in the flood zone saying no, and 20% saying I don't know. And it was also the result at the metropolitan region level, with over 20% of people saying I don't know if I live or not in a flood zone. Similarly, for indirect effects, people being affected by power cuts, heating outage, water cuts, and so on, we have more than half of the people actually exposed saying that they are not exposed. The irony here is that when we show those results, the first reflex is to say, yeah, we need another risk communication campaign to explain to those people that they are actually exposed. But again, that survey was run 6 months after a third event, and I'm not sure we can actually help decision makers to have a more powerful risk communication campaign than 3 actual events over the course of only 2 years. But then also many people are not evacuating when expected, and many people are adopting risky behaviors during the floods. Here you have multiple correspondence analysis, meaning the closest the predictors in red are to a behavior, the more they are associated, and the farther away they are, the more they are opposed. So if we try to see the people not behaving the way first responders and authorities want them to, so people defying the bans, having risky behaviors, going underground during a flood, or refusing to evacuate, we find an intersection of the usual suspects of social vulnerability situations, with lack of social capital, low income, unemployment, newcomers, people without a car, people without insurance, less education, and so on, but also some connection with people having special needs, and especially people in disability situation. On the other hand, at the other end of the graph, you have the desired behavior, so people adapting their house and changing their behaviors. And as you can see, we have no social demographic predictors for those behaviors. The main predictor is actually previous flood experience and higher flood risk awareness and perception. So here the takeaway is that maybe some people do not behave in the way first responders and local authorities do, but it might be, and we tend to see that it might be because they are in socially vulnerable situation. And on the other hand, the best way to promote the changed first responders and public authorities want is to give previous flood experience to people. So the different risk communication campaigns and different informations did not have the effect that being personally and directly affected by flooding had. So what have we learned? That responders with previous flood experience have higher perceptions of flood risk. Respondents who are aware that they live in a flood-prone area have higher flood risk perceptions than those who are aware of this situation. And those two factors highly contribute to changing the behavior of the people, helping them to adapt and actually abide by the evacuation order. On the other hand, people in socially vulnerable situation tend not to abide, to defy the bans and not to evacuate, but they already have higher flood risk perception than other respondents. So targeting more risk communication campaigns to them will not make them change their behavior. What will make them change their behavior is to actually reduce social vulnerability. So here, the main takeaway is if you want people to, if you want to increase the rate of evacuation, making sure that people are aware they live in flood-prone area is the best single things you can do. The second best thing is actually to reduce inequalities and reduce social vulnerability, because people in social vulnerability situation are the other main concern. Thank you for your attention, and most of this research has recently been published, so here are the reference to the publications.
Many thanks, Samuel, and for all of us here today involved in trying to prevent flooding or to alleviate the consequences of flooding. It was really interesting to hear how different socio-economic groups perceive flooding, how they recover from flooding, how they approach flooding, those who won't evacuate, don't evacuate, the reasons why they don't. If that has raised lots of questions in your mind about how to ensure that everyone in a flood risk area responds in the correct way, there will be an opportunity to put questions to Samuel when he joins us as part of our panel in the last part of today's conference. We're going to take a very short break now, around half an hour. If you're watching from France or you're with us in the room joining us from France, you'll know there's an English custom of afternoon tea. Everything stops for tea. And that's what we're going to do now for a little while. Also a chance for you to have a comfort break if you need one. So we'll reconvene a little bit earlier, I think, than scheduled, probably around 3 o'clock, so that we can keep on course. So a little comfort break now, and chance to have some refreshments, and we will reconvene at 3 o'clock. Thank you very much.